Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video over here on That's Comical, a must-be-read video, by the way. And if you are watching and it happens to be a Wednesday, happy new comic book day. Before we get going on this conversation, of course, I've got the two greatest people I could ever have comic book conversations with on this channel. Although, not to say that April and Shay are bad. I love chatting with them too. But Andy and Cammy are here, guys. Happy New Year. It's great to see you both.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
We are still doing Superman. And the reason why, even though the 85th anniversary has officially passed us by, do not fret. There's going to be plenty of 85th anniversary Batman and 40th anniversary of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle stuff to do in 2024. But there was one Superman story, a must-be-read episode, that we had to do regardless. We were supposed to do this before the end of 2023. Life happened, and here we are. And we are going to be talking about what I may think may be one of the most unique Superman stories ever given to us. It was written in 2004 by one of the greatest names from 90s comics, Kurt Busiek. Also, it is the 30th anniversary of his big blow-up issue series of the Marvels. Guys, we should probably talk about that later on this year too. But anyway, we're going to be talking about his 4-issue miniseries of Superman Secret Identity, a standalone, and if not the best, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best. And I know this because I actually told Cammy and Andy to read this because they did not read this before we actually decided that we were going to do this must be read. This is my second time reading it. So, Cammy, because you have the bright, shiny new internet, I'd like you to give me your overall thoughts on what you thought of this book before we go into the details. Because as a comic book person who is brand new, I thought that this would be perfect for you as the still somewhat outsider looking in.
Yes. It's refreshing. It was a lot of fun to read because it's such a breath of fresh air story. There was just so many elements of this series that I enjoyed thoroughly, and I think it was just summed up so beautifully. I don't think this could have went on beyond 4 issues. I think it was very well packaged, and it was very enjoyable, and I'm glad that you recommended it to me because I probably would have never just picked this one up on my own.
Yeah, this was actually recommended to me by someone in the booktube community who I unfortunately don't talk to anymore. And it's such a jarring shame because this individual is a big comic book fan, and I would have loved to have had this person here for a couple of episodes. But no, this one was just sitting in the back of my mind, and I finally said to myself, let me check this out. And I was shocked by how beautifully written it is. Not to say I wouldn't have expected anything less from Kurt Busiek because he is fantastic. From Marvels to Astro City, I love his work. Andy, what did you think of it overall?
I loved it. I thought it was phenomenal. It's I don't have more to say like without going into detail. I thought it was phenomenal. I absolutely loved it.
It's a basic story because this is not technically Superman. This is a story that takes place in our world. A boy is born in a little town in Kansas that is not Smallville, by the way, and he is raised by a set of parents whose last name just happens to be Kent, and they also happen to be big Superman fans because, you know, at this point in time when this book is written, it's obviously supposed to be taking place in the late 90s, early 2000s, and at this point in time, Superman is already the icon that he is. So, a small family living in Kansas, they have a son, their last name is Kent, let's name him Clark. And boy, does this kid not embrace it as he's growing up. As a matter of fact, he despises the fact that his name is Clark Kent. And he despises the fact that people constantly reference Superman. The thing that truthfully immediately sucked me in was the fact when you see those pages of him shoving all of this Superman toy and game and whatnot stuff, he's shoving it all into a closet because he just doesn't want to look at it because he hates it so much. And then out of nowhere, one day he just happens to get Superman's powers. And that's the basic premise, everybody. It's so cool to literally see someone who just hates everything that Superman is becomes everything that he's ever hated. And I guess the big question is, am I going to embrace it, or am I just going to be even more furious with the fact that, like, oh dear, what else can go wrong in my life today?
And I think that was one of the things that made the writing so beautiful, is the fact that there is this love-hate relationship that he has with, the icon that is Superman, but you see him constantly going back and referencing the comic books, and you see those beautiful retro images, the vintage comic book images, and it pairs so well. There's such fluidity with the writing style of this, because you as a reader in essence are kind of torn, because you're kind of feeling that with him as you're reading it. At least that was how I felt. Do I want to hate Superman too in this story? Do I want to really just embrace this character for what it is and just try and block out Superman like he is? But it just becomes such a quintessential part of his identity, and kind of in essence creating who he becomes. And I think he becomes a better version of himself because he's fighting this so hard.
Mm-hmm. My main kind of like lens into this story, and I think Stevie did a good kind of overview of like where it comes from. I think the thing that draws me to it that's so interesting is that it's a guy getting Superman's power who's not really Superman in the quote unquote real world, getting the powers. But what strikes me is it's not markedly different from the original Superman origin story, in that we're equally it's portrayed as the real world, but we're equally reading a comic book. We're equally reading about someone who gets powers they didn't expect they were going to have, but it's grounded in such a way that it kind of strips away the layer of the like golden age comic book baggage that we carry, and lets us think fresh about the idea of being someone who suddenly has these phenomenal powers. There's the fun wrinkle of like, oh, but there is a Superman story. It's in the comic book and you believe this is happening for real. That kind of like helps sell that a little bit. But really at its heart, the big thing is just making you rethink at a basic level what it means to suddenly have Superman's powers in the real world, in the way that maybe one might have thought about Superman when you were 12 issues in, 85 years ago. So yeah, I thought it was a really interesting deconstruction of the character for that.
Yeah, I'm sort of starting to realize that deconstructions of superheroes are now turning out to be some of my favorite stories. That and horror-themed stories featuring anthropomorphic animals. I am turning into such a weirdo. It's so weird. But what I also really appreciate about the book itself is the fact that it doesn't go completely in the direction of the Superman mythos, yet there are certain elements of the Superman mythos that are featured in the book in very different ways. Like, I love how at the very beginning, when he decides that he actually wants to do some good with the powers that he has, about how he tries to tell his story anonymously to a reporter, and it turns out that he loses that trust with the reporter. So I found that to be very interesting, about how we're going to include the press in here, but it's going to be done in a very different way. Also, how the government is involved, it's done in a very different way. How there's also references to things like Star Labs, but it's done in a very different way. And I also will say probably one of the most important things was how grounded the story was, because the truth of the matter is, Kurt Busiek could have gone in very different directions with the story. He could have actually shown other metahumans coming alive with powers throughout the story. Like, he could have seen a version of a speedster. He could have seen a version of someone who can breathe underwater. And yet they still basically wanted to let people know that here's a guy who has always felt alone in some way because of the fact that he had this name that was associated with an iconic popular culture character, and yet he didn't want to be a part of it. And yet, even when these things are happening, there's nobody out there like him in that sense that is there to be someone to talk to, at least at the beginning of the story. I really respected and appreciated that Kurt Busiek went in that direction when he could have gone in a much more fantasy-driven way. Not to say that this wasn't fantasy-driven, but he could have done a little bit more with the fantasy, but he really wanted to try and keep it close to reality as he possibly could.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciated that element of it because it didn't get too fantastical. You know, there wasn't a lot of bangs and pows and stuff. There was just what you would consider real life horrors, you know, real life atrocities and real life violence, you know, and not to an epic scale, just natural occurrences that he was intervening and assisting with. And I think that, again, carried the story very well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was definitely, I mean, not to overuse the word, but I agree, it was very grounded. And I think by stripping away that idea and really making you focus on what does it mean to really get Superman's powers, really helped sell that.
So let's talk about the fact that at the very end, he ends up actually discovering love with a woman whose name just happens to be Lois, but not Lois Lane. That's another thing I really appreciated. And I also really appreciated that he actually becomes very lovingly attached to and eventually marrying a woman that's Indian. That was
Mm-hmm.
such another interesting thing that I really appreciated. And I also really appreciated the fact that he also didn't even want to necessarily be a reporter. He wanted to be an author. So I really liked that as well. So it was the little things that were still very much on the grounded theme that I just really appreciated. And it really gave me the atmosphere that I really appreciated throughout the story. I loved the atmosphere. It was very warm, but at the same time, you sort of felt for him and you always felt that someone was watching him, or like he felt that someone was going to do something really bad to him and you were waiting for someone to like truly expose him for what he was. And yet in the end, it never happened. And he encountered a lot of very interesting things that we'll obviously discuss as this conversation continues.
I also appreciated the writing on the subtlety of the introduction and kind of the fluidity of the character of Lois, because a lot of the times when you have a diverse character, so much of those elements of their diversity is thrown in your face through writing, at least nowadays. Now, granted, this story is a little bit older, but there tends to be a lot of push on you need to catch this, you need to understand this. And it's almost like authors sometimes talk down to us when they're trying to integrate, you know, new and innovative ideas. And every element of who she was, whether it was her heritage, her family, or even her background, you know, with her criminal record, there was just so much of just a natural flow of introducing those different layers and pieces to her. And I just thought that made her such a more beautiful character. And as he was falling in love with her, I think me as a reader was falling in love with her because, you know, you grow to appreciate her, and she just becomes, to me, more beautiful throughout the story, and not just physically. I mean, you can see her connection with him and her want and desire to protect him just as much as he wants to protect her. And, you know, as we go through the family dynamic of their family, it's a really beautiful thing to watch.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
because when he officially reveals to her what he is, it's like she doesn't feel scared. Like she only appreciates and loves him more. And yes, Cami, you said something that we never really discussed here on the channel. The whole thing with the whole concept of people doing the whole diversity thing for the purposes of checking boxes. Every person who's got a brain in their head in the comic book community says the same thing. Give me a good story, and I don't care what your cast of character is. I just want a story that I can sink my teeth into and love. And this is one of those stories.
Yeah, there's so much amazing writing out there that is diverse, but I think that when you get slapped in the face by an author that is deliberately trying to tell you how to read their story, it's very frustrating. So reading comics in that regard from a diverse standpoint is just so much more palatable and refreshing, because I don't feel like that happens in the comic book world. There's just a story, you're given it, whether you love it or hate it, it's here, and this was the creator's imagination. And it's just it's a beautiful thing when a creator creates something that they love, because you can see it in the final product, not creating it for the sense of, I want people to love this. And of course, as a creator, you want an audience, you want people to talk about it and share it and love it. But at the core of it, the creator needs to love what they're doing. And so when you are trying to flush and, like you said, Steve, check every box, sometimes the story falls short and sometimes you just get this mess. And there was no mess here. There was a lot of messy things happening, but it was done so well that it just kept you intrigued, and you wanted to know, you wanted to be a part of his growth, and you wanted to see the next chapter,
Mm-hmm. And I did feel, sorry, I wanted to say, I agree with you, Cammy, the kind of like, I felt like falling in love with the character myself, like while going through it. I thought it was a really beautiful take at the character of Lois for a number of reasons. I love that she shared Clark's frustration of getting made fun of for her choice of name and being, and just like, oh, this is not your first time either, like them like kind of having their meeting like that. That was great. But the thing that was amazing to me was I found myself in a way that I am not usually in a Superman story that's like retelling an origin or retelling a part of Superman's history. I found myself genuinely terrified when he made the decision to tell her about who he was, because I was kind of confronted anew with the idea of making yourself vulnerable and sharing this secret in a way that in most Superman comics, unless it's like known for some twist or they're doing some strange dark retelling. I mean, this is Lois Lane, right? And so like Lois and Clark, they will get along. Like we know these characters, they're a famous duo, right? But in this version of the story, I'm like, this is the real world. This is terrifying. Like this is very strange, life-altering news. And you feel every beat of what that could mean. You feel the you've been lying to me so far, which is a little bit more played out in comics. You also feel the just like shock and horror of like, how could you get over that this is what's happening, since this is the real world. But I was very taken aback by the relief that I felt when she was genuine in her acceptance of who he was, and my apprehension leading up to his telling her when he made the decision he was going to, which is not something I have felt in a Superman origin retelling in a very long time.
Yeah, and the other thing that I'd appreciated very much about Lois too was she never seemed to lose her cool or her composure when he had to go and do something as Superman, because she knows he's the only one out there who can do this stuff. So the fact that she also had not just a love for him, but for the love of the well-being of the human race, not as much as a grand scale, but she knew that she just happened to be eventually married to Superman, and that Superman is the only one that is going to be able to do the good things in this world that ordinary men don't necessarily have the power to do. So the fact that she was able to understand that, because eventually they would also have a set of twin girls, and he wasn't even able to be there to see them being born. But I love the fact that he said, I could hear everything that was going on. So
Yeah.
he sort of felt that he was there at that exact moment. And I love that. I think it may be my favorite part of the whole story, because it's like, oh God, what happens to men when they cannot be there for the birth of their child? But the fact that he actually said, I was able to hear everything, it sounds like everything went perfectly, I'm so happy. Like that was probably one of the most heartfelt, warmest moments of the entire comic book.
And what Andy was just saying about living through your emotions, that's where it really got me in the feels when she was going through the childbirth process, because in the back of my mind, I was like, oh God, please don't let anything happen to her or to the babies, please, because he's
Yeah.
not there and she gave him permission and I don't want him to feel guilt. I don't want her to not
Yeah.
be there. Like, this has to be a good moment, you know? So yeah, there was some definite emotions reading this series. And it's cool to have that experience because it's not every day that you can read familiar characters or familiar storylines and be so vested in your emotions and really just, get encapsulated with all those feelings that you felt upon, discovering these characters for the first time.
Let me just tell you this, Tammy. If this may be the very first piece of work that you've read about from Kurt Busiek, let me just tell you this right now. That's his writing style. There's a
Yeah.
lot of good things that I have read of his that I would love to recommend you. Like I said, I mentioned Marvels earlier. You want to talk about a story of a true story of someone on the outside looking in. Marvels is a 4-issue miniseries about a news reporter and cameraman watching the Marvel universe form from the beginning of World War II with the original 2 creations of Marvel, the Human Torch and the Submariner, all the way to the death of Gwen Stacy in the 1970s. So the fact that you literally are seeing the Marvel universe unfold from a true outsider looking in, so you get the human aspect of it. That's Kurt Busiek in a nutshell. So I would love for you to read Marvels. As a matter of fact, I think we all should read it because it is the 30th anniversary. And I think maybe Kurt Busiek would be a great Creators Notes episode to do as well, because he's a writer who I personally love, and there's so many great things that he's done.
What I was going to mention about the story that I think is kind of encapsulated in the moment of the childbirth, and it's funny, Cammie, the apprehension you talked about was something that had not bubbled up to my mind for this conversation, but I did feel at the time, I kept thinking something horrible is going to happen, something horrible is going to happen, something he's going to blame himself. And it was a very real, like, anxiety and waiting that was created in that moment. And what I'm really struck by, beyond, yes, that was well done, I felt the anxiety, it was created. What I'm struck by is, this is a macro comment on the book. I don't think I could ever experience, and I know, Steve, this is your second time reading it. I don't think I could ever think of this book the same way I did on my first reading, because of how fresh it was and how unexpected everything was, even when things went well. It's interesting. Upon a second reading, I can see myself looking at this story as some kind of comfort food, because it's really heartwarming. Like, it's really, really good. And we see a good person with a good heart find someone who appreciates him, have a family that loves him, and overcome the odds, right? It's really nice. It's really simple. But in that first reading, even though it turns out to be, for all the wrinkles of it's actually the real world, a fairly prosaic Superman story, you get to be along for the ride with it for this one in a way that I haven't been in some time. And so I think in a reread, I'd feel that comfort that I do with other Superman stories again. I don't think lightning could strike twice in that kind of roller coaster. But I wanted to point that out, because you're very right about the feelings it creates. It's just so interesting that at the end of the day, it's so positive. I spent all this time worrying, which I think there's something to be said about the Superman character there, because we do that because that's what he's doing. He's constantly worrying about getting discovered. He's constantly worrying about what people will think. Will the government find him? What will happen to his family if he does things this way, if he does things that way? Listen to everything, catch everything that goes on. And so we're right there with him. But at the end of the day, he's Superman, and it's okay. It's really well done.
And before I forget, I also just want to make a very important mention, because when it comes to a great story, what makes it even better is a great artist. And I will say that Stuart Immonen did such an amazing job with the work. I mean, I will always say that when it comes to Kurt Busiek, Marvels is one of my all-time favorites, just because of the fact that not only did Kurt Busiek write the story, Alex Ross drew that comic book. So if you remember Kingdom Come, Cammy, you know exactly what kind of art I'm talking about. So Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross, that was the story that introduced me to both of those people, and that's why I'm such a fan of both. But Stuart Immonen, I think, captures that atmosphere, makes the drawings of the characters very realistic. And I think because of the color palette that he uses is what makes it that comfort food. It's like that icing on the cake, as you said, Andy. That color palette makes it so warm because it's not like so bright and bubbly and in your face. It's very dull mostly. Like, even when you take a look at him wearing the Superman costume, it's not the bright blue, orange, and yellow. Like, it's a faded blue with a deeper red and a little bit of yellow. So it definitely captures that soft tone.
And I have to say, because this is just the horror person in me, but as he began to age and being the writer that he is, I'm sorry, he looks so much like Stephen King. I just could not get past that, especially with the glasses. I'm just like, oh my God, every time I saw him behind, a newspaper or sitting at that typewriter, I was just like, oh my God, this is like Stephen King in Superman's world. Sorry, I just had to say that.
So the other thing that was very interesting in this story was the whole role that the government played. And that is definitely one of the more standout parts of this story, because of the fact that he knows the government is trying to find him because of the fact that he's apparently this guy with superpowers. But when he discovers one of the reasons why they're hunting him, and he discovers the lab and the whole story about the meteors that landed on Earth, that is where things start to get very interesting and take a very dark tone, because when he sees what he sees in that lab, that's where he really starts to question his own existence. Like, was I actually born to my parents, or was I actually the only successful experiment to these people? That was definitely one of the more outlandish parts of the story, and that really resonated with me. And then, of course, he meets the guy who he says to him, listen, you got me now. Here's what's going to happen. I'll make a deal with you. You need me, you call me, but please let me live my life. That is something that sets this Clark Kent very, very far apart from the iconic Clark Kent / Superman. Because if there is one thing we have to remember about this story, this is a human being, 100% earthbound human. This is not an alien. This is a man with a completely different set of emotions, a different way of thinking when it comes to tackling these types of subjects. So you're not going to get the big blue Boy Scout this time around. You're going to get a guy that just wants to be left alone. He's got a life. He's got a family. I'll do your job. But if I do it for you, just keep my identity secret, and that's it. Or the other thing that he also does that Superman doesn't do, but there's a lot of times where they hope that Superman would go in that direction, and we see those fan fiction stories and those alternate Superman stories. He says, if you do not do what I say, I will give you hell. And he's not afraid to say it.
Yeah, I think that all, is a good encapsulation of it. I think that makes sense. I was very the scene where he like gets himself out of the lab was very disturbing, and you're right, the story does take kind of a turn there. And I was leaving this story thinking that it's this 4-issue miniseries, but I really got the sense that we kind of did every Superman story in the 4 issues. And when thinking about it, I think of it as we have our origin, we have our relationship with Lois, we have our look forward, which is coming next with like older Superman and like the world following Superman, all that. But this is this story's version of like the super villain. And it's the government. Like this is the closest thing we get. There's no Lex Luthor. I mean, Lois even makes a joke about next you're going to tell me you have a friend Lex who I got to meet, all that.
Yeah.
But like this is our supervillain, and it's that supervillain story that is linked to the foil of this Superman, which is it is entirely based around not letting him live the human life. So I think that's really important that you pointed out, Steve, that this is an all human Superman. We spent a lot of our Kingdom Come discussion talking about some biblical allegory there, and the difference between Shazam and Superman, and the kind of all God, all human, all of that, like very intentional stuff in Kingdom Come. But here we've got a guy. This is just mortal man Superman. And so his foil then, as a result, is a grounded, in some ways corrupt, but in other ways functioning properly government that is just not equipped to deal with someone who is so outside the bounds of the society that it was created to serve. So I found it deeply disturbing. I also found it incredibly fitting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also, again, this whole situation also just added so much to the relationship that he had with Lois, because he never hid anything from her. He was always upfront with his wife. And that is, again, one of the real reasons why this story has such a big heart. Because we obviously feel the love between the two of them. And the fact that he has so much trust in her that he really is able to tell her everything and anything just makes this relationship all the more special.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think the fact too that they had given her a life of her own, like she had a job, she traveled, she had a purpose outside of being a wife. I mean, that was obviously an integral part of her life, and it was important to her. And of course, as the family dynamic grew and changed, and there was different elements added to that, then she switched her focus, which any family person does. That's just your priorities change, but that said, I think that's so important as a female reader to see that, because you want someone who's not only safe and secure in their own mind, supports their significant other, accepts them for who they are, but knows who they are as well, because that makes that person, that character whole, and they have much more to offer not only the story, but all the other individuals they interact with, because they are offering their true self. So I can't speak highly enough of Lois, and just how beautifully she was written. And I really enjoyed the layers of her. There's just something really special about this version of Lois.
There's lots of layers to everybody in this story, and that's what makes this story all the more special. So then let's get to that last issue, because this is where we see a couple of things that we still have yet to actually see to a certain degree with Superman himself. I mean, the fact that we actually see old Superman, and we have seen an older version of Superman in other ways. Kingdom Come is a perfect example, but this is a very different kind of older Superman. This is a guy who is definitely feeling his age. He was talking in the fourth issue like he was able to do this and this and that, and now he can't really do that much anymore. And the good part about that is when he's gotten to that stage, he doesn't really care about the fact that he has these powers. All he's concerned about right now is, how are my girls doing? And I love how a lot of that story is about him thinking about the jobs that they have, the guys that they're dating. Are they living good lives? Are they healthy? And that's another one of the great pieces of this story. Again, go back to the fact that it's very grounded, very human. And of course, we get that little inside joke with the snow globe, which is also really, really touching. But I also really appreciate the thing about this book is that Kurt Busiek really knows how to do something that not many writers can do. There are a select few that know how to do the following: stick the landing, end it. He knows how to put that beautiful bow on top of that full package. And we'll go a little bit more deeper into it, but I just love the fact that he knows how to give us such a great ending to his stories. This was a perfect way to end the story.
It was a beautiful ending to this. I mean, you already are falling in love with these characters. You feel like you're part of the family, and to watch them all age and come into their own person and to develop the roles and just see how this family they stay a family. And I think that's another wholesome element to this story, because so often in Western culture, we're divided. We often live in separate states. We don't get to see our grown children as often as we would like to. We miss out on a lot of holidays and just all those pivotal moments, when our children have children and those sorts of things. So to see this family stay together and kind of come into that next phase of life, and they're still such a pivotal part of each other's lives, is such a beautiful, cherished thing. And it was just heartwarming to end it on that note, because you felt like there's been so much emotional roller coaster with this read, and then to get to the end and have like a really feel good ending and feel good about where the other characters are heading in this family. I was very impressed by how this story just flowed from start to finish. You don't always get that. I mean, you'll get a good story, you'll get a good beginning, a good middle, good end, but you don't always get a full flushed, oh my God, that was a great read, and this was that for me.
Well, that's what I said. Kurt Busiek, he knows how to do it. He gives you a great beginning, middle, and end. I love how he ends the whole storyline with the government. Literally, he has that last meeting with that government person, and he basically says to him, I'm getting too old for this. I'm retiring. And so he said to him, you're off the hook. And Clark is feeling that hesitation. He's feeling that doubt. And he's literally saying to him, just like that? He's like, just like that. No questions, no nothing. You are free to go. We don't need your services anymore. And I think what was very interesting was he didn't really say it, but you could tell in the back of his mind, even if he didn't even get the words out properly, he was like, you sure you guys are going to be able to handle these types of things if I'm not working with you? And they're saying, we got this. At least he gets the thank you and the appreciation, and that the guy we worked with, I'm sorry, I forgot the guy's name. I completely forgot this agent's name, but he actually
Was it Malloy?
Yes,
Did I
yes,
make that up?
yes.
Malloy?
It was something with an M. I couldn't remember if it was Malloy or Morgan, but
yeah, okay.
he developed a friendship with Agent Malloy, and at the end, he basically admitted to Clark, "You're a good guy. And that's why I'm letting you off the hook, because you really are a good person. Even if you've got these powers, you're still a good person."
There was still a little quip in there though, because he's like, well, this has been fun. He's like, yeah, has it though? Really?
Yep. Yep.
But I did enjoy that dynamic of it, because, being such a reader and a appreciator of government within storylines, and I love how that develops. I thought that was also very well flushed, but there also was a grain of humanity that was given to Malloy, because you kind of saw, hey, I'm a dad too, and I've got, kids, and I just kind of want to retire and move on into the sunset myself and enjoy my family and whatever years I have left. And so it's interesting to see how something that is often an entity that's put into a story that you either love because you're kind of the villainous reader, or you hate because you're like, the government is interfering again. It's a nice dynamic to see that in the end, they can walk away and appreciate each other for what they did and the relationship that they shared, but knowing, we live separate lives and we're going to be okay without each other. So c'est la vie, good luck. It was fun, kind of.
And I will say, going hand in hand with kind of my statement of this story works in that it resets us to be shocked by things that have become prosaic. I do think it's worth mentioning that in line with it also being kind of like a feel good comfort food kind of story, this ending I think would be hokey if done in most Superman books, because you're right, it puts a bow on it. It's perfect. It's like arguably too perfect. It just really works because we were so strung along by the emotion of it the entire way through that we kind of like have earned this kind of breathe out. And that's how Clark feels at the end of this story. It's he's lived his whole life to keep it together, to have his family, to be there for the world, to feel that he's using his power for good without losing who he is as his own person. And then he gets to take a breath. And it's perfect. But again, it feels like something that we have just spent the last 3.5 issues building to before we start to feel that sense of calm and ease.
Right.
So it's not hokey in this context.
Well, that's really what it is, because at the end of the day, what's the ending? He finally gets what he's wanted all this time. He got his peace. He got his quiet. He got his comfort. He can now just relax. And like you said, Andy, take a breath. Except for that one little interesting thing that happens towards the end. And that is the fact that he finds out that his twin girls have superpowers. And they're actually going out on their own little adventures too. So let me ask you guys the honest question. Was that a little too much? Was that something that you wanted to see happen? Or was that something completely unexpected? Because in my attitude, it was like, they're going to have superpowers. I can feel it. So the minute I found out that they had the superpowers, I was like, okay, they've got them. So now there's more super people in the world. And what are we going to get from this? And what do we get from this? More down to earth, more human. He's like, they're stronger than me. They're going out. They're being good people. But at the same time, he's just being a dad. Like, okay, Dad, we're going off to go fight some crimes. Call me as soon as you get there. Like, he's still acting like a dad. And that's what I love so much about it. But how did you guys feel about that additional little superhero element, and I guess you could say a little treat for the senses?
I honestly thought with the twin aspect that only one of them was going to have superpowers.
Oh.
So the fact that both of them had it was a little surprising to me. And to kind of keep with the vibe that Andy had just shared, I didn't want it to be cheesy. I won't use hokey, but I didn't want it to be cheesy because there could have been a cheese factor with that, because you are surrounded by this story that has given you a buildup of just this human being that has obtained superpowers within your teen years. In the back of your mind, knowing he has children, thinking, okay, there's a possibility that maybe in their teen years, they might also come into that superpower. But if they do, like, what is that going to look like? Is that element going to ruin the story? And where is that going to take the story from here? Because it could have also been a cheese factor in, what does this look like for the family down the road? Once again, though, the writer does a really awesome job of kind of just packaging that up for you. And you kind of, in a sense, want to see a story within a story and kind of see what happens with the grandchildren and all of that, but it's perfect the way that it ends. You don't need to know. You can just imagine that world, all in your own. But I love their names, how they kind of kept on with the tradition, Clark and Jimmy and stuff like that. But yeah, I honestly didn't know that it was going to be both of them, but it turned out okay. It was a cute dynamic.
I was actually I was surprised that they ended up giving them powers as well. I really loved the whole scene of their making a conscious decision to stop testing the kids. I thought that was beautiful. I thought it was really admirable. And it seemed like something that would be really hard for them to do as real people, and I found it an admirable thing. Um, I thought that it was a really nice inclusion in that, for as much as I'm saying it was wrapped up with a bow and we kind of were owed to the lack of anxiety, it was fun to get to do the thing where Clark is getting nervous that he's, if not losing his powers, they're getting weaker. And he's coming to terms with the fact, I thought I'd have these forever. And he's like, well, I guess I didn't know anything about the powers. So why did I think I would have them forever? And as soon as he starts having those thoughts, his daughters have these powers. And now it's like he has spent his whole life trying to take care of them, being nervous about taking care of them. Now he has to be nervous in an entirely different way, which is they are now out and doing the things that he was doing, and he's not there to protect them while they do it anymore, creating a whole new layer of terror in his mind. And it's really funny. There's that great moment where he's sitting at the table with Lois, and he's like, how can he just sit here while they're out doing this? And she's like, I've been doing this for years, Clark. And as he gets a taste of his own medicine.
Yep.
So it was, you know, for as much as I say it was all wrapped up and we were owed kind of the step down, you get that like superhero version of the human parent fear, of learning to let go and learning to let the kids go off and do their own thing. And without him being, he's still Superman, but without him being the fully realized Superman he was, it lands pretty well, I think.
I would really like to know if I was able to actually meet Dan Jurgens one day. I would like to know if this was one of the stories that inspired him to create John Kent, because Superman never actually had children in his life. And of course, John Kent, when he was created in Superman Lois and Clark, which is another great Superman story that Andy and I discussed a couple of months back, you know, now we actually see the true Flash real Superman, technically isn't real, as a father figure. So I would really like to know if Kurt Busiek's book was the inspiration for John Kent. It would personally make me feel happy if it was.
I had that thought at the time. It had slipped my mind to bring it up, but it definitely did strike me as having some similar undertones.
I think that's pretty much where we're going to be able to draw this to a close, guys. I mean, I have read a lot of great Superman stories over the last couple of months, and I have been reading some really good Superman stories for the last couple of years. And there's a lot of other people out there who rank the best Superman stories. And almost always, the number one Superman story usually ends up being either Kingdom Come or Alan Moore's Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. But I got to be perfectly honest with you guys. I truthfully feel shocked that not many people talk about Superman's secret identity, because I personally feel if it's not my number one, it's definitely in my top three. But there's no other Superman story out there like this one. This one is truly something special. And I'm really surprised that not that many people talk about it. And I'm glad that we did tonight.
Well, and I think that's kind of what happens in the book community as a whole. You know, regardless of whether it's comic books or other types of media, people tend to just regurgitate what they see and what their friends are reading. And then before you know it, it's like this mass wave of everybody's reading the same thing. And then, you know, now with the society of the FOMO, oh my God, if I don't read this. And I'll be honest, I tend to stay away from things that are very hyped, because a lot of the time it's not really all it's cracked up to be. So I think it does take a channel like this, a diamond in the rough, to kind of say, hey, there's other origin stories out there. There's other things that maybe you forgot about, or maybe you missed this one. And so I think that is one of the most important dynamics of our channel, is that we are talking about things that maybe other people aren't talking about. And it does get people excited. You know, I've seen people comment on videos or on Twitter, you know, of other forms of media that we have, saying, hey, thanks for putting this on my radar. And to me, as a reader, as a reviewer, as someone who puts themselves out in this you know, internet sensation, whatever, it's the most complimentary thing a person can do, connecting with you by saying, hey, I loved your recommendation. Thank you for talking about this. You know, thank you for having a discussion about this, because I probably wouldn't have picked this up, or I probably wouldn't have even discovered this had you not said something. And so it's always been kind of a quest of mine in all my other, you know, forms of social media, to find those unique reads or books or authors and share them with the world. So I'm really grateful, Steve, to you and to Andy, because you guys are constantly putting things on my radar. My TBR is ridiculous, thank you not. But I am a well-rounded reader because of people like you. So I hope that other people will see this video and go and pick up this story, because it is important to not just read what everybody else is reading.
Well, I also think the most important thing about this specific book is there's so many people that are just so intimidated by reading comic books just because of all the lore that's out there. Remember now, we're going now on 86 years of Superman being in existence. But the thing I love so much about this book is that you could just tell this person, you can just read this one Superman story, and you don't have to read any other Superman story. You don't even have to read any goddamn comic book for the rest of your life, for all I care. This book is its own unique, self-contained story. I just want you to read a good story. Superman just happens to be the main element in this story. But that's what I would say to people. And that's the thing, Cammie. I would have just said to you, even if you never wanted to read another Superman comic or never another comic book in general, just read this, because it's just its own thing and it's special.
Well, and that brings back a lot of feelings from when I first started this journey with you, in that I was extremely intimidated by just the amount of reading material out there. And my brain kept overthinking, you know, because that's how my brain works. Where do I start? How do I read? In what order do I read this in? Do I have to read this before I read that? And I think that, again, this is a unique element to our channel, because we give people that peace of mind, letting you know, hey, you don't have to go and read everything. You don't have to consume everything that's out there just to simply enjoy a story like this. You don't need to even know everything there is to know about Superman. You can simply just go into this and be like, oh, this was a good place to start. Now, where else can I go? And I think that for me has been my personal journey in just saying, hey, I've started here, and sorry.
It's okay. We always welcome members of the animal kingdom on our videos.
She's very needy today. That for me, that is, you know, something that has helped me in my journey, is reading for the sake of enjoyment, and then it takes me somewhere else, and I can say, hey, I love this character, what else can I read, what else can I consume? And so if this does that for someone else out there, all the better, because I want more readers that are like me to not be intimidated, to want to pick up comic books and say, hey, I can read them too. Because heck, I started this journey, 4 years ago now? That's crazy. But I have consumed so much old and new comics, and I feel like there's still so much I haven't touched on, but I feel like there has been so much I have, and I'm getting it, you know, and I'm not lost anymore, and I recognize characters, and I understand storylines. So if I can do it, anybody can do it.
Yeah, there's still so much that I haven't read. I mean, there's stories that I know are great. I mean, like, I don't know if I'll ever have the opportunity to read anything from the Golden Age or the early Silver Age, but because of the fact that I read things from like the 70s all the way through today, I kind of feel like regardless, I know these characters. I know them well. I know where they're from. So that's the thing. You don't have to read everything. You read what you like. I mean, I will always give you guys recommendations because I just want you to read great stories. I would do the same thing with a movie, with a CD, with a book. I just want you guys to experience something awesome. And I say that not just to the two of you, but I say that to everybody that's watching this video. That's why we are here at That's Comical. We want you guys to just get exposed to stuff that is awesome. What is wrong with that?
And this is an awesome story. I think I made it clear how much I loved it. It was such a ride. It was such a joy to read. I think it's a really easy recommend to people. Um, the thing that I will say is I spent the whole time after reading it and this whole episode thinking to myself, I was a little off. I was thinking to myself this entire time, Steve is going to, at the end of this, demand that I tell him where I rank this amongst the greatest Superman stories ever told, because that's like Steve's like favorite last question. So I'm like, what the hell am I going to say when he gets to that question on this one? So just so you know, while that wasn't the question you asked, there was a tone of it in what you said. So what I'll say is that I need more time with it. I often say that after I read a book fresh, I kind of want to let it sit with me. I even alluded during this recording to the fact that I think subsequent readings of this will be inherently different than the first reading, and I'm curious to see how it holds up. I'm willing to say that I don't think that necessarily alters how I feel about the book, because I think the magic of the book is a radical deconstruction and retelling of the character that I can't hold it against it, that you can't feel again, because that's its purpose is to make you feel Superman again. So if it accomplishes that once, it succeeded, and it did. So I would have to think on it more. It's a very unique book. It makes it hard to rank it. But just in a vacuum, putting the whole ranking thing aside, which I had on my mind this entire conversation, just thinking it would be relevant, I'll just stick with it is a truly phenomenal book, really well written and really heartfelt. And I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to read it, because as the two of you were talking about, I think this one easily could have gone completely unread and unknown by me, were it not for this conversation and prepping for it. I'm very thankful for it.
You're very welcome, my friend. I'm always interested in recommending you and everybody else out there some awesome stuff. So for all of you who have watched tonight, we really do appreciate the fact that you took the time. We're looking forward to, God willing, I think this is the year, guys, because I also feel that this is also going to be a very big year for Western comics in general. I just got a feeling it's just because of some elite writers and artists out there that I think are going to get it done, and I'm excited about this year. But I'm more excited about bringing the people out there who are watching this show some really great content. And the most important thing is that I have some truly passionate people here that are loving all of this stuff just as much as I do and just love talking about it. So all I can say, everybody, is if you liked the video, leave a comment. Also, feel free to give us a thumbs up. We'd love to talk to you. And don't forget to hit that subscription button and that notification bell so you are up to date on all of our latest content. And I promise you guys, I know that I sound like a broken record, but I promise you guys things are coming. Lots more stuff. So until then, thank you all for watching, and we will see you in the next one.
Bye all.